wanted to make a short video talking about some suggestions for improving the Valkyrie spear line and attempting to add another spec, another playstyle to the class. I think anyone who's familiar with the class or really familiar with the game in general, you know that when you're looking at a spec tree here, there it's an illusion of choice. There's so many abilities, there's so many styles, there's so many spells, but the reality is, if you see this here, you got to get this in almost all cases. You know, there's some examples where that isn't necessarily true, like solo champion, but with almost no exception, especially if you're playing in small mana group play, you have to get 42 shield if their class can. It's just too strong. It's a black hole. It kills any sort of class variety or um, you know, player choice to an extent. Um, so if you're playing a Valkyrie, I mean, it's 50 sword, 42 shield, or it's 41 spear, 42 shield, and then some amount of mending, 33 to 41, some amount of Odin's Will, most likely 12, but this line's a whole nother conversation. What I'd like to see, and I think is pretty easily achievable, is making it so it's beneficial to spec 50 spear and to play your character as a two-handed character. You know, obviously, it's you're not going to be able to compete with shield. It's too strong. I don't know who came up with this, Mark Jacobs, whoever it was. This is lunacy how it works, especially with how it's easy to swap. There's no penalty. It's just not good. But I think there are ways to create a weapon line in Spear that allows you to, in solo and small man play, I think in AVA play, the design space is so incredibly limited that there's almost no way to make it so you can have a full two-handed character and ignore shield. But so that in those smaller scale plays, you can go 50 spear, go parry, go, maybe 41 mending. If Odin's Will ever gets cleaned up, maybe some, a little higher Odin's Will, and perhaps not be as good as your shield counterparts, but have some success. And I think the initial change to do this is really simple. And I think the hammer style line is a perfect example of a line that allows the user to have a variety of tools. It has a second in chain side stun. It has an off parry stun. It essentially encourages a user to play as a two-handed character. It has the means to do so. All right, quickly jump over to a spreadsheet I prepared with all of the spear styles, the entire style line, color coded. Red leads to red, orange leads to orange. Got the hit, defense, growth rate, everything listed out here. I'll probably run through the basic line, just kind of point out how bad it is. Then jump over to a slightly reworked line. I think that would maybe open up that second spec or third spec, at least for solo play. I think small man and group play, it would be too difficult. And then I'll go to a fully reworked line that might work for small man play. It has some tools to compete directly with shield as a spec option. I don't know how realistic it is. It's kind of in line with how I would envision a total style rework for all the lines, kind of how you'd approach it from a design perspective. But let's run through the existing line real quick. Got your starter abilities. I don't think there's much to say about these. They are what they are. And then, for some reason, we have our first parry chain, our first of two, which is, it's not a terrible style, but you're never going to use it. You are never trying to get a parry reactionary off as spear. You have a shield, you will be slamming, you will be spamming roundhouse. When you're not slamming, when your target's not stunned, you will be spamming roundhouse. There is almost no reason to get a bleed off. Maybe with the occultist regen, there's some room for that. I don't. This is a dead style line right off the bat. So your 4 and 6, or I guess your 4 and 8 styles are dead. Taunt, great. Every line needs a taunt for PvE. Every line needs a detaunt for PvE. Your taunt chains into an anytime snare. Why? No one knows. You have pin. This is useless. Just more empty space. Second parry chain, stab into raise. Yes, this is a 0.38 off parry bleed. So you're giving up 0.5 growth rate for 7 additional bleed. Otherwise, they're identical styles. Why? No one knows. Stab chains into a 50 spirit DD with a 0.72 growth rate. Dead style lines. You're never going to use these. So we've already got 4, 5, and then 6, 7 styles in the first 29 levels that are useless. Lancer does nothing, has a defense penalty, 0.41 growth rate. Follow up, lunging thrust, does nothing, 0.84 growth rate. I don't know why they exist, but they do. Moving on, get to your first real style, windmill, your anytime, which chains into roundhouse. The other style you will actually be using. These two kill the rest of this line in terms of design space. In my reworks, I've left them in because I think they are core for the identity. I would never, if it were purely up to me, I would get rid of this. There's no reason to have this. It's too strong. It makes it so for anything else to be useful, you have to match it or surpass it, and it's just not realistic. You're creating a situation where all the power is funneled into one style chain, one anytime style chain, and the rest of the line is just null. It doesn't make sense, but it is how it is. So I've tried to leave the spirit of that intact with my recommended changes. Other than that, you have Whirling Spear, which is puzzling, I suppose. I mean, I guess maybe you can use it when you don't want to break CC, but it's just an anytime. Not great, but it is what it is. Backstun, great for hunters, bad for Valkyries. You have shield. Why are you backstunning? There's no point. The reward to run to pure two-handed is not there. It's not good enough. You can't do it. Follow up, no one gets this style. No one goes past 41. It's a bleed. It's useless. But it exists. And then Odin's Madness, sadly, the level 50 style that serves no purpose. I'm sure some Zergers get it. I would definitely try it if I was going to try Spear Valkyrie, but it's not as good as it's just not as good. It's not as good as this. So let's talk about my slightly reworked line. I made it with this being the target spec to kind of introduce to the game. 50 spear, 33 to 41 mend, some high amount of parry, and then the standard 12 wounds will, and of course 7 shield for engage. Currently, this is basically unplayable in any format. I think with this slightly altered line, you maybe be introducing something that can be played by solo players. And I made 2 changes. The stab and the raise chain, I changed to dehaste. Dehaste that leads into a stun. Pretty much the same as the hammer line. Growth rates, I put these in as higher growth rates. I think it's more interesting when your parry, your off block, your positional styles do more damage. But If these are lower, that's not going to really change the goal of the design here. With this allows you to have an effective stun option and an effective defensive option for 1v1 fights, 1vx fights. It just gives you some survivability, and it gives you the ability to stun without relying on your shield spec. And the other style line I changed was Odin's Madness and Perforate, the side chain. I made it a 9-second stun, to 1.0 growth rate. Obviously, this could be 7, this could be 8. I think 9 is appropriate because it's a level 50 style. I think 1 is probably a little low for a growth rate on a specialized style line like this, a hybrid style line that has the 150 DD proc. But this gives the class another tool to 1v1, 1vx without having to rely on shield. This brings it in line with Hammer to an extent, and I think it really opens up this spec as something people could do. Again, it's still not going to be as good as having Slam. It's not going to be as good as going Shield and Sword, but it makes it more interesting. And I don't think this really affects other forms of gameplay. I don't think a lot of people are using Odin's Madness for the DD. I don't think a lot of people are using the parry chains. Most of them are going to have a shield out anyways. Here is my final version of what a spear rework could look like next to the original styles. When I was putting this together, quickly became apparent that something like this would probably need to exist within the context of a complete style rework, where all of the lines are getting cleaned up, and maybe there is a logic and an overall strategy in the style design. I don't think that existed during the original creation of the game or any of the expansion packs. And I think, look no further than the garbage that exists in this line. Why does Lancer exist? It's a very interesting thing to look at retrospectively and try to post hoc rationalize. That being said, I had a couple goals with this rework. The first of which was to create a spec that could directly compete with 42 shield variants as they stand. Realistically, I don't think that's possible. Shield has guard, Shield has pin, Shield has slam. It's just too much. It's too much to hope for to create a two-handed line that can actually find viability outside of solo play and maybe small man play. But we try our best. The other goal was to create a style line where there aren't so many dead styles. Looking through the original spear line, we had 7, 8, 9, 10 dead styles, just completely useless. You might use them while you're leveling, if that. They serve no purpose, and essentially they are just completely dead abilities on arrival in most cases. I think one of the big problems with DAoC is there are a lot of classes that can be played at 90% effectiveness, 85% effectiveness by only using 1, 2, 3 styles. You use your anytime, maybe use a defensive reactionary, and then you look for your positional snares. Your anytime does the most damage in most cases. Your positional styles, you generally just want to be spamming snares. And reactionaries, you're not using those generally unless you're playing much smaller scale play. At least you're not using them consistently. So that was kind of the lens I was looking at this through. Compete with 42 shield specs and make the abilities interesting. Make each style interesting. Not every single one will be used all the time, but for the players that are a little better, the players that want to really learn their class and be effective, they have these styles that give them situational power. It's not just spamming roundhouse. It's not just spamming the anytime with the positional follow up. There's really options that exist for different scenarios. And practice and skill can make playing the class much more engaging that way. So let's start with a quick walkthrough of these different styles. Okay, so first things first, left the first two styles in place. I think these are tutorial styles. I don't get why they exist. Certainly could be cooler, but just ignore that. Maybe in the long run, these become something interesting, but for now, they are what they are. First style I changed was originally return thrust, parry style with the bleed on it. I changed it to stab, and I made it a frontal with the bleed. I think this is, first of all, you don't have two parry chains, so that redundancy is removed. But also, this is a style that has a prerequisite, a positional prerequisite, and offers a small amount of utility. Bleed can shut down regen. Again, I don't think it's particularly useful, but this would be something that you'd want to have on your bars in almost all cases. It also doesn't give the defensive penalty that anytime does. So, maybe a savvier player who doesn't want to spam windmill roundhouse would be looking to use this situationally. Uh, you'd want it on your bars. Whether you use it all the time or not, it's something you'd still want to have access to. And I think the name stab a little more thematic for what it does. Why does return thrust bleed when stab doesn't? Well, I guess it does, but it just made more sense to move that name to me. Left the taunt in place, left the detaunt in place, so we don't need to talk about those. And I removed the follow-up from taunt. Next style I changed was extend reach, which was originally the parry follow-up. I made it an increased range style, a la ASP. For anyone who doesn't know, ASP was a flexible back style that increased your attack range to, I don't know, something like 250, 300. Really fun style, really fun to use to chase people down. Surprised the mechanic didn't make any other appearances, especially with such a great opportunity. And style line, traditionally based on reach, and even having a style called extend reach. So I made that. I thought that would be an interesting mechanic to add. Not a very good style in and of itself, but the increased range component's interesting with the snare follow-up. So kind of fulfill that huntress theme of chasing targets down and being able to stun them effectively. Maybe have a little increased interrupt range. I don't know. I thought it could be an interesting tool. Maybe it ends up being too strong for group play. Maybe there's unforeseen consequences here, but it's an idea, and I think it might be a good one. Next style line I changed, Lancer. Useless in the original line. It was Lancer lunging thrust. Never going to be used by anyone. Maybe while you're leveling, if that. I changed it to an anytime AF debuff heal reduction. I think something like this, could be useful situationally, could introduce some, especially group viability. A savvier player, maybe this percentage gets changed to something else, but a savvy player might anticipate burst heal coming. You could communicate with your group and set it up. In solo play, you could anticipate heal potions or IP and kind of set this up. You sacrifice your damage to set up a debuff that isn't necessarily significant, or at least in this version, but could be ultimately way more meaningful than landing your windmill roundhouse combo. So I think that's another thing. Again, you'd want to have this on your bars. You'd want to have access to it. You'd want to think about what you're doing, what styles you're planning to use, how you're going to plan ahead in a fight to use your character as effectively as possible. And then I left in place from the kind of slight rework. I left in place the return thrust raise combo. I think this is just, well, I don't think it's a great design, but I think with the styles being what they are, this is a great tool for, that 50 parry spec, or 38 parry, whatever it is, the 50 spear, 38 parry spec to have this. And then I left Perforate Odin's Madness the same way it was in the slight rework. 9-second stun, obviously that could be smaller. Maybe it does more damage, maybe it does less damage, but the idea being there is that try to land a style component, which is a lot of fun. I think one of the few mechanical things you actually do in the game, trying to get off positionals on stuck, facing, or actively moving opponents. And you have a stun as a follow-up, which is great for solo. It compensates somewhat for the lack of stun from slam, and just makes the class play a lot more smoothly. Let's see. Raise, kept that in place. Again, I left Windmill Roundhouse in place. I don't see how you get away from it. It's the core of the design here. I didn't want to totally reinvent the wheel, but I think this sucks. I think this is a black hole. And you had to give so much oomph to the rest of the line to make any of these styles usable. Left Whirling Spear in place as an anytime, slightly worse than your frontal bleed. So you're encouraged to potentially use both. If you're in front of the target, this is objectively better. But if you don't want to break CC, maybe there's a mob nearby, whatever the situation is, sometimes you're going to have to use this. So there's some decision making involved. And then this was Razor's Edge Odin Wrath is really my attempt to compete with Shield directly. And I don't know if it's successful, but I think it's a starting point. It's something to think about. Mainly looking at pin and guard as the culprits for Shield's supremacy here. You've got the stuns covered in other ways. It's obviously not as good as slam, but this is a way where you, as the Valkyrie with a high amount of parry, can contribute to neutralizing opponents with a dehaste and a snare. Again, comparing to pin or guard, and then have a unique effect that allows you to defend your group, kind of like a soldier's barricade type mechanic, or dashing defenses, whatever it's called, where you can parry for group members in range. And the caveat being, you must have the spear equipped, so you're not able to just land this, swap to your 42 shield, and stand there and be an uber defensive juggernaut. Slightly better than guard in that maybe you can parry for multiple players. Not as good as guard as it stands on Eden because it's mega buffed, but 40%, 45% chance to parry for your group mates is a seriously effective tool and can really help, especially I imagine in duo and trio play, where you can peel, help to peel for your support, your Scald, your healer, your Shaman, whatever you're playing with, caster. And you can mitigate damage, you can peel, and you can effectively block for them. I thought that was a nice way to tie the line together and attempt to compete with guard. Will it work? Maybe, but it's an idea, and I think it's one that might have some legs.